the sorts of mistakes and lessons that I've learned along the way. And so my job title is I'm the legal fellow with the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center at the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, but that's not really, that focuses more on kind of the legal end of things, but really what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of what I've learned personally, because I'm directly impacted. I'm on the registry. I've been on the registry for 12 years now, and I've talked to all sorts of different kinds of groups. And oh, do I need to stay in one place? No. Okay. Oh, well, we don't want that. I've talked to all different kinds of groups about my story. I've talked to legislators. I've talked to churches. I've talked to universities. I've talked to high school classes, I've talked to college classes, and you learn a bunch of different sort of do's and don'ts about what moves people and what doesn't move people. So I'm going to be telling you, or at least trying to impart a little bit of the wisdom that I've gained from a lot of the mistakes that I've made. I'm probably going to make more mistakes today, and so we're all going to learn together. It's going to be great. So the first thing that I really want to say, I want to ask is, how many people in here are a sex offender or have a family member who's a sex offender? Everyone put your hands down. It's a trick question. There's no such thing as a sex offender. There is no such thing. That is a made-up term. It is a legal designation. There is no such thing as a sex offender. So it's a trick question. There are people, human beings. The other day, someone came up to me and said, I'm the mother of a sex offender. I said, no, you're not. You're the mother of a son. You're the mother of a human being. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the importance of language. And I'd like to encourage everyone in this room to just drop the term sex offender from your vocabulary. Don't ever say it. Don't ever use it. Don't ever think it, because it's not true. And it's not true for a variety of reasons. It's inaccurate because the term, its tense implies a currentness. It's kind of like a job title, right? That you get up in the morning and you sort of like put on your shoes and you go out into the world and you sex offend, if you're a sex offender. But unless you're out committing crimes today, you're not a sex offender. You've been convicted of some sort of a crime, but that doesn't make you, that's not what that makes you today. It's also dehumanizing. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, it's toxic. And how can you reclaim your humanity? How can you reclaim the humanity of your family when you're using this term? Also, it trips up people's, Lori Jo Reynolds, who's a professor at UIC, she uses the term reptile brain. It triggers people's reptile brain. And then as soon as people are in this sort of fight or flight fear mode because you're saying sex offenders, and they start thinking about all these horrible crimes and all these horrible people, it makes them a lot harder. They don't listen anymore, and they shut down. So I say, that I was convicted of a sex offense in 2006. It was an illegal images case. So you say, persons on the registry, it's person first language, essentially. To the extent possible, sometimes that gets kind of clunky. You can't always say, in legal briefs, for example, you can't always say, people who've been convicted of a sex offense or people who've been convicted of a registrant. It gets clunky. So, there are other terms like registrant. But, the idea is you don't want to locate your humanity or the humanity of your family member in the worst thing that they've ever done. Because we, as Brian Stevenson with EJI says, we are all more than the worst thing that we have ever done. And that is just a truth of the human condition. And one last thing I'd like to say just about language is that, I don't refer to it as the sex offender registry either. Because again, it's also inaccurate. That implies that this is a registry of people who are going out and committing sex offenses. That's what sex offender registry implies. That's not accurate. It's a registry of people who have been convicted of a sex offense. Or in the case of many states, you don't have to be convicted of a sex offense to go on these registries. You can be convicted of non-sexual offenses. Many states have, Illinois, for example, has a violent offender registry. Kansas puts pretty much anyone on a registry. So the idea is that we want to be accurate with our language, and we don't want to be dehumanizing, and we don't want to make our work of telling stories harder than it has to be. I'll also touch on the importance of healing, which all of this that's happening, I mean, if you've committed a crime or if you've caused harm, and you'll hear me talk about this tomorrow, like I think it's important, was important for me to be held accountable for harm that I caused. It's important for everyone to be held accountable. But what happens in the aftermath of that is traumatic. Prison is traumatic. Registries, it's traumatic. It's trauma. And everyone will say, well, you deserve it. Your family deserves it. And I don't think that's true. I think that's cruel, but I'm not here to debate who deserves what. The simple fact of the matter is that this is traumatic. What everyone in this room has probably gone through in one way or another is trauma. And you have to heal from that. And there are ways of doing that, but before you want to tell your story publicly to a group of legislators, you want to make sure that you're in a good place. Because there's a place for emotion and being able to use emotion to try to persuade people. But obviously, if you're been so traumatized that you can't effectively tell your story, then you won't be effective. So the point is, just before you really get involved, you want to make sure that you're healed, that you have done the work on yourself so that you can be an effective advocate, so that you can be an effective storyteller. And then the importance of awareness is really just knowing who you're talking to, knowing your audience, knowing what they're wanting knowing what they care about, knowing what they want to hear, knowing what their values are. And also knowing what your objective is. If your objective is to tell a story because you need to heal, then that's the story that you need to tell to people that you care about, family members, friends, people you trust. That's not a story you want to tell to a legislative panel, right? And also to be aware of what your objectives are. So if your objective is to get that legislative panel to vote yes on a bill or no on a bill, then obviously that's going to impact how you approach it. So real quickly, I'll just talk about a little bit about why storytelling is important. And if you were here yesterday for David Mentz's presentation, then you've probably heard a lot of all this. But storytelling and telling our stories, telling the stories of our loved ones, it's essential for persuading people. And you'll hear me talk more about this tomorrow when I give my presentation, but I don't think that facts and constitutional arguments, they're essential to this reform movement, but they're missing something. And what they're missing is they're missing our stories. They're missing people being willing to tell them. And stories are essential for connecting with people, for moving them in ways that facts just don't. Facts just don't move people. Not in the same way that stories do, because stories humanize you. But not only is it essential for persuading other people, it's essential for persuading ourselves. Because I don't know about any of you or your family members, but for years before I started telling my story, I believed I was a monster. The shame was so deep and so toxic that I didn't know how I was going to make it until I started telling my story. And I was very fortunate that I was able to tell my story, and I found a lot of love. It's reclaiming our own humanity. When the government calls you a sex offender, what they're doing is they're telling your story for you. The objective in telling your own story is partly also to grab the pen back from the government and write your own story again. The fact is, I was convicted of a sex offense, and that's a fact about my past that I can't hide, that I don't run from, that I don't deny. It's the truth. But the truth is not that I'm a sex offender. That's not the sum total of who I am. I feel like I'm a lot more than that, and I've done a lot more than that. And then also, just another point, it's important to be aware, again, about where you are in terms of your emotional state and who you're talking to, and also how they're responding. If you're telling someone your story and you're getting the sense that they're shutting down, or you're not feeling like you're having the impact that you want to have, then it might be good to check in with them, or check in with yourself and see if you might want to adjust how you're approaching this. So this is actually something that's, this is a tool that's put together by the Opportunity Agenda that I found to be very helpful in storytelling and also communication with various people. It's VPSA messaging. And you can go onto the Opportunity Agenda's website, and they have tools, they have videos, they have tutorials on how to implement VPSA messaging. But what VPSA stands for is value, problem, solution, and action. And the idea is that this is a tool that you can use in really any kind of communication, whether it's storytelling, whether it's a press release, whether it's a blog post, whether it's a news article, whatever it may be. You can use this to try to wrap whatever communication you're trying to give to essentially persuade people. So the idea here is value refers to, first you identify a set of shared values that you have with whatever audience that you're communicating with. So if it's a conservative legislator, for example, he or she is probably not going to be moved by the claim that, well, these sex offense registry laws are deeply inhumane and unfair and unconstitutional. It's not going to care. What that legislator might be moved by, however, is that these are extremely costly. So you might focus on the cost argument. I mean, depending on who you're talking to. It's just for example. So then the problem is you want to identify and frame the problem that is standing in the way of sort of reaching that value. The solution is, again, how do we deal with that problem to achieve our shared values? And the action is you want to end with an ask. And that just depends on whatever your objective is. So this is just kind of a for example. This is something I've probably said a lot of different times in a lot of different ways. But, and again, you can go on the Opportunity Agenda's website, and they have a ton of different tutorials on how to craft these. But this is just my for example. The value here is that we all care about ensuring the safety of our communities and preventing sexual harms. That's something everybody agrees on. Everyone in this room agrees on it. Everyone outside of this room agrees on it. It's something we share. The problem is that, however, our approaches to addressing these problems are not only ineffective, they're also extremely costly, deeply inhumane, and unconstitutional. That's a problem. The solution is that our laws and our policies should be informed by data and best practices when it comes to sexual harms. And then therefore, vote yes on Bill 2. Therefore, please consider repealing residential banishment laws. Therefore, your ask is just contextual in whatever you're trying to persuade people of. Now, I mentioned Lori Jo earlier. In her work, she's found that in this context of sex offenses and sex offense registry reform, there's actually another component of this that people need to hear before they're going to listen to you. And that's accountability. Because otherwise, I'm sure you can raise your hand if you've had the experience of telling your story or trying to persuade a legislator or anyone else, and they say, well, you're just whining. You're just complaining about being treated unfairly. I mean, I've had that happen. And that's because what people really want to hear, what people need to hear, especially if you're directly impacted and on the registry, so they need to hear an accountability statement from you. And this is something that, so Lori Jo has kind of tweaked the VPSA messaging a little bit, and you need to have that accountability statement in somewhere up front. So this is the same example I had on the previous slide, just with an accountability statement baked into it. So we all care about ensuring the safety of our communities and preventing sexual harms, and people who cause sexual harm should be held accountable for those harms. When you're telling your personal story, talking a little bit about accountability here, there are a few things that I've found to be very important when you're talking about your own personal story. You're talking about crime that you committed, harm that you caused. The first very important thing that I've learned and I share with people is do not relitigate your case. The judge was crooked. The witness lied. Your attorney sucked. All that may be true. It may be true. Don't say it. Do not say it. I mean, if you're just complaining to your friends and your family and your priest or whoever, you do whatever you need to do to get that off your chest. I don't mean to minimize that there's a ton of pain that comes with that. I mean, I worked in criminal defense for about 9 years. I did death penalty mitigation. We did trial and appeals. I know the legal system. Well, I don't refer to it as a criminal justice system. I refer to it as a criminal legal system because it's not a system. Well, it's not a system that concerns itself with justice. It's just a legal system. Okay? So I know it's messed up. But this is not the time. Do not relitigate your case. Doesn't matter how screwed over you are. So you just want to say, my name is so-and-so, and I committed this crime, this offense. I took responsibility, or I was held accountable, and I served my time, and now I'm trying to move on and live a productive and meaningful life. I'm trying to raise my family, trying to get an education. But people need to hear that accountability statement. And related to this, don't minimize. Don't say, well, she wasn't really that harmed, or, don't do that either. Because what happens if you do either of these things, if you minimize your responsibility when you're talking about accountability to other people that you're trying to persuade, they shut down immediately. They will not listen to anything else that you have to say. So you have to take responsibility, and you have to be accountable. And what I've found in my experience is not only is that the right thing to do, but people respond to that. They just do. And then the last thing on here just relates to innocence claims, essentially. And what I mean by this is I also did work for the Innocence Project. I know for a fact that there are probably innocent people in this very room. There are innocent people in prison. I also did, I think I mentioned I did death penalty work. I know we've executed innocent people. We have. Absolutely. If you're wanting to tell your story to advocate in this context for registry reform, it's not something that you can get into, related to the first point about not relitigating. And believe me, I have sympathy for people who have been convicted wrongly of crimes. But if you're trying to persuade people, the way that I've been telling people that my suggestion for how you approach dealing with innocence claims is when you're talking about the accountability piece, because you can't be accountable if you're innocent, right? You can't say, well, I was held accountable for an offense that I didn't commit. And I don't think it's fair to tell people that they need to lie, right? That they should lie about being guilty of a crime that they aren't actually guilty of. So what I say is if you're innocent and you want to tell your story to try to advocate, you should say in the accountability piece, and I was convicted of an offense, and I have an innocence claim, but I don't really want to get into that because that's really not what I'm here to talk about. And just move on. And also when talking about, just backing up a minute, when talking about your case and talking about accountability, you don't really need to go into the details about it. Just very brief. It doesn't need to be extremely thorough. And, so, and this is actually this is a dumb meme that I created, actually, for use on Twitter. But this is after a lot of you may know about the Michigan Attorney General, Dana Nessel, who filed briefs in state court cases, basically saying that not only is the registry ineffective, it's also punishment. And this is coming out of an attorney general's office, not a court decision, not a defense attorney, not a civil rights litigator, but an attorney general. So this is the Drake meme. I don't know if anyone in here is familiar at all with Drake or this meme, but anyway, I thought it would be something funny to just drop in here at the end. That's really, honestly, most of what I had to say. I mean, in closing, and you can get in touch with me via my website, or I'm also on Twitter, so that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. But what I really want to, the ultimate thing that I want to say is I think storytelling is, and I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow, but I think it's essential to how we move people. You can talk about recidivism stats all day long. And those are, don't get me wrong, the social science is essential. The lawyers and the constitutional arguments are essential. Without those, we're also dead in the water. But at the end of the day, these laws are all undergirded by fear and animus and disgust and hatred. And the only way that you can't diffuse that with a study, You can't diffuse that by saying, but it's unconstitutional. Lots of things are constitutional until they're not. What we have to do is we have to sort of diffuse people's fear. And the only way I've found to do that is by telling your story. And so I'll close, I might get into this tomorrow as well, but I'll close with a story from my past. So in law school, one of my favorite classes was litigation skills, because I grew up in the Law and Order generation. So you have those courtroom scenes on Law and Order where the prosecutor cross-examines the defendants testifying, which by the way never happens in real life. But the defendant's testifying and the prosecutor's, giving this withering cross-examination, and the defendant just breaks down on the stand and confesses to everything, and it all happens in 30 minutes, and it's great. It's good entertainment. That's not how any of this works in real life, by the way. But I loved it. And so in law school, one of my favorite classes was litigation skills, where they taught you how to do all that stuff, how to do direct examinations and cross-examinations and closing arguments. And my professor was he was a federal prosecutor. And I worked for a criminal defense firm, and he's a federal prosecutor. But so despite us being, on opposite ends of the legal system, we were great friends. Actually, we hit it off. We'd chat after class, most nights. We'd talk about cases that were going on, or, I'd approach him with questions, and we just clicked. And then one day after class, what came up was, I can't even remember how we got on the topic, but sex offenders came up. And he didn't know that I'd gone to law school after my own arrest. That's what occasioned me to want to go to law school. He didn't know I was on the registry. And so he was talking about sex offenders. I was like, well, shit. I don't know how this is going to go exactly. And, he said, you know what we ought to do with them? He said, you know what we ought to do with them? We ought to take them all. We ought to line them up against the wall. We ought to shoot them. That's not an uncommon, I'm sure we've all heard that. And so I was thinking, well, shit, I hope you don't have a gun. I hope you're not armed. And I don't think it was that night, but eventually I did tell him. I told him my story. And it flipped him 180 degrees. Such that actually a couple years later, we had a federal trial at my office, and he was the prosecutor. And he pulled my bosses aside, and he was like, "I just really want to commend you all for giving him a job. He's an amazing law student. He's going to make an amazing attorney someday. And I have a lot of respect for you all for hiring him." Because I went to law school to be a public defender, but they wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole. So anyway, the point is, I could have said, "Well, but don't you know the recidivism statistics say that they have the second lowest rate of reoffense as any class of criminal?" Or I could have said, "Well, don't you know that like the due process clause and the 14th, I could have said any of that. Would that have moved him? Does anyone here think any of that would have moved him? Would have said, "Oh, okay, we shouldn't line them all up against the wall and shoot them." Not that those things aren't important, but the fact was he knew me. And he knew that I wasn't a monster. And the thing is, when you're talking about sex offense registries, people expect a monster. They expect you to lie and hide. And when you show them a human being, which is what everyone in this room is, by the way, that challenges people in ways that nothing else can. So that's why I think this is important to consider. And I'm happy to take any, we are way ahead of time. So I'll be up here for as long as people want, and I'll just take questions. Yeah, Mary Sue.
I'm interested in what you said about telling the story but not telling all the details.
Yeah.
So when you're reading the legislature, sometimes you're only going to get 10 minutes and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So if you want to tell the story, but you don't use a line.
Sure.
I don't think I need this, do I? Okay. There's a line where you can go too far telling your story. Of course, like you're talking about when you shared with the man that you knew for so long,
Yeah.
You can go a little bit further because you know that you already had that connection with him. But when you're talking to a legislator and you're going to tell your story, but you've only got 10 or 15 minutes, and you also want to get them to support a bill or oppose a bill, you want to educate them. And how would you, so right now you're meeting with a legislator.
All right.
How much or how little or what would you say to tell him your story?
If I just have a few seconds, if I just have 90 seconds or something like that, be like, look, I would say something like, I'm directly impacted. I committed an illegal images offense, and I was held accountable for that, and I served my punishment. And since then I've gone to law school, and I'm trying to lead a meaningful and productive life. It doesn't have to just, short and simple. Depending on how much time you have.
I think that's a good example.
Yeah.
But and then you move on, but then what I'm here to talk to you about is.
Right, yeah.
So, and if they're interested, isn't it true that they're going to ask you, well, what exactly did you do?
Yeah.
And then you feel free to go a little further. So
Sure.
I'm the legislator, and I'm saying, well, what exactly did you do?
Well, I downloaded illegal images. In my teens, I had a pretty massive problem with internet pornography, where I downloaded essentially everything I came across. And most of that was legal, but some of it wasn't. And my girlfriend found it on my computer and went to the police. And that's what I did.
Okay, I think that's a great example of telling your story and just basic.
Yeah.
Without, okay.
You don't have to go into any gory details or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to ask everybody, please wait for the microphone because we are recording it for everybody to watch later. So even if you have a very loud voice, we need the microphone. Thank you.
So I think it's important also, just as a sidebar from my own experience, to acknowledge when you are telling a story that you have learned the consequences and the effect and impact. So acknowledging that you understand it was wrong, things like that, to add those context tweaks. In Illinois, one of our challenges, I mean, I think as an advocacy organization and as an advocacy community, we all agree that telling our stories is important, and it contextualizes our efforts. Our challenge in Illinois has been that many times storytelling can be done with a negative sort of twist. It leads, if you're not doing it in a deliberate way, it leads to sort of down directions and paths that we don't necessarily think is helpful.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we like to do is that, we like to create situations where people can learn and can practice.
Yes.
And as a result, we ask people on a regular basis to come in to sessions where and I can't stress enough the VPSA model.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you caught it, I'm using it right now. We ask people to come in and practice, and we videotape them, and when we let them watch themselves tell their story, and we craft it. You brought up Lori Jo, a monster in the industry.
She's a
huge.
beast.
And she's working with homeless people who also have to register. And to be a person who has nowhere to go at times is difficult enough, and then to have to register in Illinois as a homeless person, I don't even want to get into it now. It's a whole different conversation. But we're asking them to tell their stories, and we need them to learn the right way to craft it. So I would recommend the VPSA model to everyone in this room, and I would recommend that you practice with it over and over and over again. That's my comment, and I don't know if you have an additional comment on top of that.
I'll just follow up really quickly. Is there coffee somewhere? Is that Brian? Okay. Oh, thank you so much. I'll follow up with a couple responses, which I think everything you said is totally on point. I should also mention, and this is also something I meant to include when Mary Sue asked me about you're talking to a legislator. The fact of my story is that my arrest saved my life in so many different ways. I'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow, but yes, you absolutely need to say, I'm thankful for what happened to me. What I would say, because it's true for me, is I'm thankful for what happened, even despite the pain, even despite.
I regularly say, I wish I hadn't arrived where I am, the path that I found myself in.
Right.
But I can't.
And then yes, training is also, I think, a very good point, and one that I wish I would have included in my presentation. This is because I think it is possible to tell your story, but tell it in a way where you're doing damage, especially if you're talking to the media. If you're talking to the media, then you have to, I really highly encourage you to seek out actual training on how to talk to media, because you can do a lot of damage by doing that unprepared, even with the best of intentions. Thank you for your comments.
Right here. First of all, a very quick sort of basic question for you.
Yeah.
The programs, are they free? Do they cost? Because there are going to be some people who...
On the website, the opportunity, I think that there's at least some materials on the website that are free. I'm not sure if they have programs that cost or not, but you can at least get more information on their website.
The other question I wanted to ask is, we heard from Paul Dubling earlier about the work that was done compiling the studies. Okay. What about the utility, the usefulness of maybe us at our different state organizations taking the time and effort to get people to tell their stories where they're archived, and if a particular bill comes up or if it could be tied in with one of these studies, that we would present to our local, our state lawmakers. I'm following the old adage that all politics is local. So what are your thoughts about the usefulness, the utility of getting and archiving stories on the state, even on the local level, and tying them in, using them not necessarily verbally, but maybe in written form to go along with studies that we present?
I think some of that work's starting to be done by various organizations who are, there are even some mainstream justice organizations that are becoming more involved in these issues. Families Against Mandatory Minimums, for example. And So I think there's some of this work being done, and I do, as I said, like I think stories are essential, and I also think that it's essential for people to tell their stories publicly, not anonymously, which I understand that like there's a risk, and I'll talk way more about this tomorrow. So I think with those sort of caveats, you have to have people who are willing to tell their story, people who are willing to be public, and people who are willing to be trained. And then I think all those things being true, yeah, absolutely. I think that could be certainly a force for change. And I think that's starting to happen. But I'm a horribly impatient man, and I wish it would happen yesterday, but we're getting there, I think. I hope.
I just, telling my story, I know nobody wants to hear it, and especially friends and close friends and family members. Some might, after years of treating them wonderful and great, they oversee what happened to me 30 years ago. What I want is to get off this registry. Why is my 1986 conviction from somebody that has exactly almost a similar conviction in 2012, he gets an opportunity to plea bargain for 10 years. I got a life without even trying to plea bargain.
Yeah.
I just want fairness
Yeah.
to give me an opportunity.
No.
And every state I know is different. I'm in Texas. I know I wouldn't want to live in Florida or Arizona, but I want the same as Missouri or Connecticut to say, okay, you know what? You did your time. I did my time. Mm-hmm. I stayed out of trouble for 30 years, over 30 years, and having dinner and visiting from the same victim that I was accused of in my house or at their house. They ought to see something. Now we love to travel. Now we're limited.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing that I'm really hoping, because I don't want to go back and redo the trial. It ain't going to do us any good, what you said. Or bring everybody back to that memories. After everything they said, all the smoke cleared, it wasn't such a big fire. But it's still burning me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that your sentiments are felt by everyone in this room, myself included. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to take you back to something that you said near the beginning, that the storytelling is useful for healing.
Yeah.
It's also useful for advocating.
Yeah.
And those are different kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to I wonder if you can give some advice on deciding whether or not somebody has healed sufficiently to tell their story for advocacy. We have a support group in Michigan, and we're doing a lot of visiting of legislators now because of the Dozie Snyder lawsuit, class action lawsuit, and order that the state has to pass a law or the judge will decide what the law is.
Right.
And we have problems with some of our people who, I'll using your terminology, I think that they're not sufficiently healed to do the advocacy. But I'm asking partly how I can guide them into those the right frame of mind to be able to speak effectively.
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm definitely not. I'm not the grand poobah. I'm not the decider. In terms of who's sufficiently healed and who's not. I just know that even in my own experience, when a lot of my pain was still raw, and that's not to say you can use your pain. You can use your pain, you can use your emotion. Like, those can be very powerful tools, and they can be very authentic, but you have to be deliberate about how you use them and when you use them. You don't want them, you want to be driving the car, you don't want your emotions to be driving the car, so to speak. And I think that what you said is true, that these are different kinds of stories in different contexts, like stories to educate versus stories to heal. And a lot of that depends on who you're talking to. And what my experience has been, how I healed from my own pain, was telling my story and telling it to my friends, telling it to family, telling it in recovery communities, telling it in church, finding places where I can tell it, and be transparent. And then eventually, slowly, very slowly, I started to heal. So I can only give a suggestion that worked for me. I don't know if it works for anyone else in the world, but it's to keep telling your story. Not necessarily to media or legislators, but keep telling it. Find friends. I'm constantly amazed at the number of people that I talk to in this movement who've been directly impacted, who they haven't told their family. They haven't told their parents, or brothers or sisters, or I don't know how you can survive like that. So that would be my advice. Yeah.
Hi, I have a unique opportunity because I'm also a business owner. I am able to go to police, other communities, churches, and explain that I am a business owner that hires those who have been charged and convicted of a crime. I will add that some of those are sex offenders. Those who have committed a sex offense.
Get out of the room. Security.
Oh.
No, thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you do.
The truth is that I only hire those who have been charged with sexual offenses. I won't say that outside of this room because I have to be an equal opportunity. But I have the opportunity to go in and talk about what it's like hiring those who were on the registry and let them know that those are the best employees ever.
Yeah.
That
absolutely.
those are the people who will work the hardest because they also know that it's going to be harder to get another job.
Absolutely.
We also have the opportunity to say, guys or girls, because I do have women, it's easier to get a job if you have a job. Nobody planned at 5 years old that they want to make jelly the rest of their lives. That's what we do. But I think that going there, we've had the opportunity to even, our whole team has felt better about, that. And we have approached it that way, and we're getting through Virginia. We are getting through Virginia that way.
Well, good. So. Thank you. Thank you so much for, please give her a round of applause.
Hi. I have a different tack to this. As someone who's committed an offense and bearing the horrible consequences of it, and I'm still with my family and seeing young people grow up, and sometimes I go back in time and say, what could have I said to myself for this not to happen, with the prevention is better than cure argument. So what would you say to a teenager who's engaging in risky behavior that might lead to a collision with this criminal legal system and be effective to make a difference? And that would help in the healing process for me, because I'm able to use my experience and pass it on and prevent additional destruction.
Absolutely. I mentioned I'd given a talk to high school students. It was probably the world's only, bring your sex offender to school day, but which I guess I use sex offender, so I gotta get out of here now. Is it a great idea? I don't know. Well, anyway, so to answer your question, I gave a talk to high school students. And I did that because that was about the age when my issues with internet pornography really began to blossom. That's when I really began to get compulsive with it. And so I told them my story. That's what I was there to do. I wasn't there to tell them about registries are bad and, you shouldn't. I didn't talk about any of that. I talked about my story and how, it destroyed relationships. It destroyed my self-esteem. It took from me, the joys of, being sexual in a committed relationship. And it also, of course, got me involved in the criminal legal system, right? And I also talked about kind of the legal aspects of, here's like, sexting, for example, is quite popular amongst teenagers these days. But what, of course, most teens don't know is that that's actually a crime. Production of and possession of and distribution of child pornography. And that's what I did. I just told them my story. And I was just open and honest and transparent. And after I gave that talk, I really had no idea how that talk was going to go, to be honest. But afterwards, a lot of the students came up to me and they thanked me, which I mean it's always nicer to be thanked than it is to be yelled at. But a lot of the students also confided in me their own problems. And so, in my experience, that's the way to help people, is with that direct, open, honest connection. And I think the way to do that is by using your story to bear witness. So that's what I would say.
Hi. I want to comment on what you said at the beginning, because a lot of people on the registry refer to themselves as sex offenders.
Yeah.
So when we get together, when I get together with our group and they say that, I tell them, I says, don't refer to yourself as a sex offender.
Right.
Because you're not.
No.
You may have been an offender when you did the crime,
Yep.
but that doesn't make you one now.
Yep.
And also, we've also been trying to get lawmakers, the professionals who keep referring to them as sex offenders.
Yep.
It says, and we say they aren't. Refer to it as sexual offenses,
Yep.
not sex offenders.
Absolutely.
And, we don't always get our point across, but whenever we refer to any literature, we don't use, even in our state from Connecticut, with the bill that they had come out, when we did amendments to it,
Yeah.
we didn't refer to it as the sex offender registry. We referred to it as the sexual offense registry.
That's exactly it.
And, so we're hoping that catches on soon enough.
In any legal brief I work on or have worked on where I'm dealing with people who have been convicted of sex offenses or these issues, or anything I write for, I'm also managed to stumble into freelance journalism somehow. I deploy the same sort of tactics because, to me, again, not only is sex offender inaccurate, it's deeply dehumanizing. And when people think about themselves as sex offenders, I can tell you from personal experience how deeply shaming and toxic that is. And it's impossible to do anything to move on with your life if you believe that about yourself. And why is it that the government is wanting to do that to people, to freeze them in time? It should be that we want this system that heals everyone, right? That heals people who've been harmed by sexual offenses, but also that heals people who've caused that harm. But that terminology and all the terminology that we have around this stuff just essentially freezes people in place so they can't move, they can't grow. So I can't stress enough, anytime I hear people say, I'm a sex offender, it probably gets annoying to some people, but I go, no, you're not. You're not. Quit it. Or parents or family members or whatever. So I can't co-sign enough on that. Thank you.
To piggyback on that, in Arizona, our county attorney doesn't even use the term sex offender. He says sexual predator every time he refers. And so part of what I say is that when we hear sex offender, when people say sex offender, we hear sexual predator, and that is not the case, and that's something that I include when I speak to legislators.
Yeah, and I also think that this, so framing sexual predator, it's that's animalistic, right? It's you're literally an animal. But I also think that framing of sexual violence helps to sort of perpetuate it, because we know that most sex crimes are committed by people who are not on a registry, right? And so to the extent that we think, oh, well, these are all like monsters and predators, and they're hiding in the bushes, and they're waiting to grab your children. Well, guess what? They're people you know. They're your friends. They go to your church. They look like everybody else, because the truth is, they are everybody else. So, yeah, that language is also, I hate sexual predator, sexually violent predator. These are all just totally made-up terms that have no bearing in, they're not medical terms, they're not psychiatric terms, they're just legal terms made up out of whole cloth that we use to essentially kill people.
So I believe in best practices. And I think that's what the conversation is about. What are the best tools, the best practices that we can take as we talk about framing the message? And I recall in my lifetime when I did work with our HIV/AIDS population, every time I come into the conferences, I put that blueprint up against what we're doing, and it's so identical for the stigma and all of those things. One of the things that we found successful was when we brought in to go to speak to our legislators, we would bring in a support system. That family would come as a family, not the person who just was living with the AIDS virus or disease, but the entire family would come. The neighbors would come. People who were a support system. And I'm thinking that maybe one of the models or one of the ways we can do is when we do go to speak to our legislators to tell them our story, to bring that support system. Now, I'm not saying bring the whole whatever, but your neighbor who knows that you're living next door, your priest or your person of faith, those that are important to you, that, and even the vulnerable community that we, society would want us to believe that they are the ones that are going to be hurt most. Let us bring that group, that small group, 3-4 people in front of that legislator who are also voters, because that visual is so important, and then tell the story. But what they're seeing is, my goodness, there's a child in the room. Yeah. Or there's a youth in the room. Yeah. Wow, there's a woman in the room. Yeah. All these areas that they say, that legislator has to go back with an image. And I found when we did that work that we were able to edge them along to support bills that we were looking for in the HIV community. I believe that model could work. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
No, I think that's an absolutely critical point, because what you're talking about is you're talking about humanizing people. You're talking about humanizing them. And so if you see someone who has a family, who's married, who has a child, who has parents, who has brothers and sisters and people that love them and care about them, then it's really hard to say that they don't deserve basic human dignity. It's really hard. So I think that's absolutely true. Like my wife, she actually couldn't make it to the conference, but otherwise she would have totally been here, because she also does this advocacy work with me. That's actually how we met. It's a long, I'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. But people, when people realize that like we're a family and like I'm just sort of a regular guy, that also challenges people's perception about what these issues are. And she's also extremely brave and talented in her own right in dealing with, well, not only like agreeing to marry me, because I feel like just agreeing to marry me just because I'm really stubborn and really difficult she deserves applause for that on its own, but also the collateral consequences of dealing with the registry, the family members. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of family members in this room, and it's not just the person on the registry. It's everybody, everyone. Anyway, I do think that that's a really good and essential point about getting families involved and ensuring that people are humanized. Because like I said, yeah, it's really hard to say, oh, well, you're a sexually violent predator. Well, but they have people who love them. So that's a great point. Thank you.
I just wanted something to say about the healing thing that you had said. When I was asked to tell my story, there was no healing. Like, I didn't even talk about it other than to just my family. I'm still not healed. I've dealt with a lot of anxiety being here this week. It's an ongoing thing. But he's right. The emotion, the passion, being driven, that emotion you can use that for that, okay? Not being healed all the way is a helpful thing, all right? And for your story too, if you can just be, what's your name, sir? Jeff. If you could just be the best Jeffrey that you can be. And when somebody sees your record 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road, I said this to Paul the other day, they're going to know he's a great guy, no matter what they saw about you. If everybody can just be the best you that day, to make everybody, like you said, we're not perpetrators, we're not monsters, and then they go, oh, wow, that person's really a neat person. So how about we just do the best we can every day while we're trying to make bigger change?
Yeah.
And that's all I got to say.
No, absolutely. Oh, wait, there's someone right there.
Okay. Yeah, I think you mentioned the collateral damage. I think that, for me, when I do tell my story, that's what I emphasize on, because I want to get off the registry more for my daughter and my family than for me. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they've adapted to it and everything's fine, but they still have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And unlike any other crime, this is just, I understand you commit a crime, the family still has to deal with the consequences, but there's an end to it at some point.
Right.
And this, there's almost no end.
Right.
The family's punished.
Yeah.
My daughter's punished, and my daughter doesn't deserve it.
Right.
So that's a message I would give to someone is, you know, you all know it's not effective to do anything. And to a degree, I mean, I'm like you where I still feel somewhat of a guilt. Well, I'll deal with that on my own terms. But I don't want my dear daughter, you know, my daughter's 25 now. I'm afraid for her for sexual assault just like anyone else.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, my whole family has to deal with this.
Yeah.
And they've adapted, but why should they?
Right.
You know, I've done my time. I'm done. Leave my family alone.
Sure.
But there's like 30 people affected by it, almost on a daily basis, and it's just not right.
No, I mean, I think it's absolutely important to, you know, to the extent that you can also highlight how this is damaging people who have done nothing wrong. I mean, you said something that reminded me, this is actually one of the first things that I guess sort of got me interested in the idea of telling your story, but something you said reminded me of it. There was a news story, this is probably, I don't know, 10 years ago. I think it came out of Virginia or someplace, but there was a neighborhood meeting about there's a sex offender that's going to be moving into the neighborhood. And so, you know, they circulated flyers and like, we're going to have a community meeting to figure out what we're going to do about this predator. And so the dude showed up to the meeting, right? The community meeting. And he like walked to the front of the room full of, you know, people, and he said, hey, I'm the dude that you're here to talk about. And, you know, he said something that you just said. And that's it. I have a daughter too. And I'm also afraid. I also have fears about her being harmed. You know, I'm just like everyone else in this room. And at the end of that meeting, like the fear, it just like totally dissipated, right? People actually, at least what I remember reading, is that people came up to him after the meeting and were shaking his hand. So, you know, I think it is important to be able to highlight that. Like what you were both saying, it's just about humanizing. I mean, that's what it is.
Hi, I'm also someone who asked to register. Sorry.
You're also what?
I'm someone who asked to register.
Okay.
Okay, right here. I'm also someone who struggles with fear of public speaking, so this is fun.
Hey, you're doing great. You're doing great. Okay.
But, you know, I kind of wanted to just stand up and do this because I've been sitting on the sidelines sort of listening for this entire time, going through the situation, and a lot of it is how do I frame my story, what do I do? And part of it, just sitting back here, is like, raise your hand, start talking. Because I'm sitting and listening and just like, hey, just share.
Yeah.
So, you know, for me, I'm kind of in a unique position. I'm a small business owner, own it with my sister who has 9 children. So that was always interesting when you're dealing with not being able to have access to children, but your business partner has children. I'm also I have a full-time job as well, and make it a point that everybody gets reviewed. Even this week, for instance, we were considering someone who is a registered, has to register, and we didn't hire that individual, but I made sure that we gave them we didn't turn them down because of that. We just found a better person, a better candidate, but made sure that they had an equal opportunity to come in, to talk, to be interviewed.
Right.
A lot of what I get when I share my story is with friends, family, whomever. You don't look like a sex offender. It's like, I'm not sure what we're supposed to look like. I get that just about as much as I get, oh, you speak English. It's like, yeah. So, but, I'm kind of in a unique position sitting back here, being someone that has to deal with the registry, that has a lot of family that's been impacted. We've got a big family. But for me, it's, I'm sitting here understanding that I have family that works at the Capitol, the state capitol of Texas, and I could go any day and sit and have lunch with them and be that face. Not necessarily, they're not legislators, but they sit down with legislators and have lunch and dinners, and a lot of it has just been fear to speak up, because I've done my piece, I've finished probation, and I wanted to just sit back and say, okay, I'm going to live my life now, like, just do my thing. For me, not to try and take this over, but it just being, it's Pride Month for me, and I'm also, I identify as gay, so a lot of it is just, how did I come out and tell my family that? How did I make that truth known and just deal with that fear? Because I come from a very religious family.
Right.
And the similarities are crazy with just coming out as, hey, I'm somebody that has to register. Those terrible people that you hear about, that you're looking up on Halloween, like, you might come across my face, actually.
Right.
So anyway, I'm not exactly sure the point of this, other than to myself to say, hey, just, if you don't know what to say, you don't know how to frame it, just raise your hand, start talking, and see what happens.
Well, you did a great job. You did a great job. What I'll say is that, sometimes people tell me, like, I'm really good at public speaking. I'm terrified of public speaking. I always have been, I always will be, so don't let that stop you. You did a great job. So thank you so much.
Hi. When I started to tell our story, or my story, as a wife of a guy who was going to prison and going to be on the registry, I didn't intentionally rehearse, but I told it often enough that I realized that's what I was doing, was perfecting it as, each time I would tell it. But I always started off the same way. I would start off with, and these are, I'm telling, not strangers, but people at church, family members, neighbors. We told a lot of people. But I would always start off with, my husband got in trouble. My husband is in trouble. And, then I would pause just a moment to let them absorb that. And then I would say, he's going to be going to prison because of child porn. And then I would quickly move on to, we're going to get through this as a family. And so they know right away that I'm not here to tell them about the coming divorce. So I would try to give them each piece so that they could absorb it in the right timing. So they didn't have time to give me that awful face. And so I sort of saved them the embarrassment of realizing they reacted wrong. So I had one friend who, as soon as I said he got in trouble with child porn, she threw her arms around me and I said, and we're going to get through it as a family. And she hugged me tighter. And then she told me much later, she said, when you told me that, I was ready to support you either way. And I thought that was kind of cool. But the fact is that she was able to support me support us, because I let her know that this was something we were doing as a family. Another thing that I would always end up with was asking them something, asking them somehow to help us. So a lot of people, I would say, you know, would you keep us in your prayers? Would you pray for us? Because, you know, first of all, I appreciated that. And second of all, it wasn't like I needed casseroles or... So, but for like when we told people in the neighborhood, I would ask them to, you know, would you, because it was something I was genuinely worried about, I would ask them to let me know, to keep an eye out for any mischief, any gossip in the neighborhood. You know, if you hear gossip, would you tamp that down for us? Would you let us know if you see any, you know? So, what other things did I ask for? I can't even remember now. But I gave them, by asking them to do something for us, it gave them a chance to do something. And I think that a lot of people want to help, but when they don't know what to do, the easiest thing for them to do is to back away and leave us alone. And so when you tell them how they can help, you are asking them into your support system. Exactly. So I just found that really useful. And like I said, it wasn't like I started out thinking this is what I'm going to do. But in looking back at how I told the story, I can see that that's what was going on.
Right.
So,
thank you.
I had one comment. I taught writing for 20 years, persuasive writing, and these anecdotes are great because you're absolutely right that no one is persuaded by facts. But anecdotal information is sometimes easy to dismiss. So what I would teach my students is tell your anecdote, your story, and then back it up with a statistic. And there are, 900,000 people just like me in this country. So I find that that is a really effective way to land your point.
I have a couple of things to share. One is simply an answer to the question, are you a sex offender? Which you periodically hear when you're standing up and taking a position on this. And the answer I routinely give people is, no, I was 35 years ago, but by the grace of God, I'm not anymore. So you use that, because one of the things that we lose in the conversation, and it's promoted, unfortunately, by some misguided treatment providers, is that people don't change. That's wrong. And we need to keep telling them that it's wrong. So that's number one. But the second one has to do with self-image. And Guy's talked about this. We've had a couple of other breakout sessions that have dealt with the psychology of being on the registry and what it does to us. And Sean has testified to that because it is hurtful to be on the registry and to endure all of the stuff that we do as registrants. But I want to share with you a statement that I came up with some time ago. And it's most important, honestly, that you learn this statement and practice it with yourself, because you have to believe it. And in some circumstances, it's helpful to share it with other people. The statement is this: my character is not defined by some state-sponsored gossip website, because that is what the registry is. All right? Its whole purpose is to advertise bad things that somebody did a long time ago. That's what its purpose is, and that's the definition of gossip. So,
say that one more time.
My character is not defined by some state-sponsored gossip website. And so when somebody wants to question my character and make comments about me, I feel free to share that kind of statement with them. But again, it's most important that you learn it and you believe it personally, because you have to believe in yourself and you have to know who you are. And that's step number one to progress and healing and being able to stand up in front of people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I just have a few. We just have a few minutes left, and what you said really reminded me of something that I want to try to just leave people with, and that's that one of the most. I read a lot of court opinions, a lot of briefs about these legal issues, right? About registries. One of the things that always gets to me, that just drives me insane, is how many people in here are familiar with the term gaslighting? The judicial gaslighting that happens in these opinions, where they say, well, this isn't punishment. This is a totally civil, non-punitive regime. You're not being punished. What I want to say is that not along the lines of you have to believe that you're not what the government calls you. You also need to understand that the government, when they say that this is not punishment, the government is lying. And I know that they're lying because I've lived it. You've lived it. Your family has lived it. Of course it's punishment. It's torture. This violates the Eighth Amendment. If there is any cruel and unusual punishment in the United States, it is this one. And so that's what I want to leave you with, is for years it's driven me insane. Am I crazy? And the thing is, if we want to have this punishment, if society decides, well, you've committed some sort of a sexual offense, and we want to have this as your punishment, I think that's great. That's great. Who am I to disagree? But let's be honest about what we're doing to people. And if the court said, well, yeah, that's what we're going to do, I'd be like, well, I guess I really can't complain. I mean, I'll agree to disagree that this is good or moral or humane, but at least we're being honest. So along the same lines of don't believe what the government is telling you about yourself or your family member, also don't believe the government when it tells you that you're not being punished, because you are. And that's just the reality of it. Thanks. Thanks for your time.